Chapter 28. Comm Camp. Vards and Nihilus came for her 2 days later. She had already sensed a change in her status. Grange had apparently won some battles on her behalf. The guard had brought her a bucket of water, soap, and clean clothes, although he took her patrol suit once she had changed. Women Lindsey had befriended brought her 3 meals a day. The bucket she had been left to use as a toilet was emptied and exchanged for one that had a top. The women told her that most of the caves were being abandoned. People were leaving, men for battle, women and children for new refuges in the west. Sometimes Sabrina saw them leaving in the early evening, marching up the opposite side of the valley, a line of ants bent beneath heavy loads. When Vards and Nihilus arrived, it felt long expected. To her surprise, the guard who had slept through most days and generally ignored her abandoned his apathy and became protective. He was middle-aged, with an only occasionally shaved face, receding chin, and gaunt limbs. He was also shorter than the rebels who had come for her. Yet, he stood in their way as they waited outside her cage.
"Where are you taking her?"
he demanded.
"We have a vehicle waiting,"
Vards said, his lips curled, his thumbs hooked through his belt loops, and his head cocked impatiently.
"They want her at the comm camp."
The guard hesitated, even though both men, double his size and weight, tapped their feet with impatience. He walked to the edge of the cave, squinting down at what Sabrina supposed was the vehicle that was waiting for her. At his leisure, he came back to the cage and opened it.
"She's been well behaved,"
he said, handing her over.
"If that changes, she'll regret it,"
Nihilus said.
"Chain her up."
The guard gave them both withering looks before plodding over to the box he used as a seat. He opened it and drew out a nest of chains, which he unfolded and wrapped around Sabrina's waist. Fetters linked around her hands and feet and linked back to the chain around her midsection. It was much like the chains Lindsey had worn when Sabrina had visited her in detention. She was utterly helpless as they led her out of the cave and into the sunlight. The sun was burning fiercely, and the rocks were radiating heat like a stove top. Nihilus cursed sourly, holding his hand to his eyes. The metal against Sabrina's skin went from cold to hot, and Vards complained that she moved too slowly down the hill. She did little to appease him. The heat robbed anyone of much initiative, and she wagered that the effort of hurting her would be too great an exertion. The vehicle was a desert runner with 6 low-inflation wheels and a hinged frame that could bend as they rode over dunes, stolen from the security ministry or the wall watchers. The driver, Rickard, leaned sleepily over the steering wheel, the air above the roof shimmering like water. Below the cab, the engine ticked as its parts expanded in the heat. Vards gave her a push and her feet tangled in her chains and she nearly tripped. The suspension coils squeaked as Nihilus climbed into the front cab. Vards shoved Sabrina into the rear bay, where rusted metal benches, the padding long gone, waited in the dimness of the overhead shell. The ceiling light was cracked and inoperable. Vards did not wait for her to sit before he slammed and locked the door. He joined the others in the front cab. The engine started, the benches vibrating beneath her, and the runner came to life. Their malice resurfaced when they hit the first dune. They slammed into the steep slope at a reckless speed and angle, surely jarring themselves in the cab, but not dangerously so. In the unpadded rear, however, the sharp edges of the benches became life-threatening. Sabrina was thrown against the low ceiling only to crash back down onto a bench, her momentum rolling her to the floor. A latch at the front slid open briefly, and through the dusty window she could see Vards and Nihilus peering at her, laughing. Next, the vehicle veered left to right, tossing her back and forth between the walls. The benches hammered her shins and ankles. When she cried out, she heard hoots of laughter from the front cab. She tried bracing herself against the back door, but Rickard slammed on the brakes to shake her free. When she locked her elbow around one of the handles, Rickard drove them down a dune face at such a pitch that she lost her grip and fell the length of the bay, landing on the window in front. Pressed against the dusty glass, she watched the 3 men howl. Their amusement was short-lived. The shift of her weight was enough to unbalance the runner, and it nearly tipped end over end, the back wheels roaring as they spun free of the sand. They were subdued after that. During the reprieve, the chains became her salvation as she placed herself in the center of the floor between the benches, wrapped the slack around her legs, and braced herself. It made a safety harness, and although the manacles rubbed her wrists and ankles raw, Rickard could not dislodge her without risking tipping the vehicle again. Not that he did not try. He still weaved and bounced the runner up dunes, causing the suspension coils to groan and sometimes slam against the chassis. No roads awaited them, and the dunes were worse than rough seas. Sabrina became sick to her stomach and adjusted the chains so she could curl into a fetal position, her knees to her chest. This was a submissive enough gesture that Rickard seemed to grow tired of yanking the wheel back and forth, and rolled more smoothly after. She lost track of time, focusing on keeping what little food she had eaten in her stomach. After a few hours, when her limbs were shaking with fatigue and motion sickness, the runner came to a stop. Her body still felt as if it was rising and falling, her head spinning. Rickard was yelling out the window to someone. She heard voices outside, a discussion. The door to the cab opened, and the runner shifted slightly with the weight of new passengers. With a stab of light, the back door opened. A slight figure with a full head of unruly hair was framed in the glare.
"Sabrina? Sprocket!" she gasped. "You look terrible,"
he said, then turned to yell up at the cab, his face red.
"Did you all beat her?"
Vards offered some excuse about her falling in the back.
"Rough terrain. You sure you want to sit back there with her? She's dangerous." "Shove it," he said, slamming the door and climbing in next to Sabrina. "You all right? Why are you all twisted up?" "To keep from being thrown around."
The muscles in his jaw worked, as if he would crush the white root stem between his molars. This one was different from the usual grass blade.
"What are you doing here?" she asked.
"Our runner broke down. I told them it would. The steering clamp they were using was fatigued. Never was going to last in these temperatures."
He had brought the desert heat in with him. Sweat left clear channels in the dun-colored dust on his face. A scarf tied loosely around his neck was wet with perspiration. His lips were dry and cracked. He moved closer and tugged a clean strip of cloth from his vest to dab at some blood on Sabrina's forehead. She wondered if Lindsey had stolen his camera. Perhaps by getting just this close to him and picking his pocket.
"You motion sick?"
he said after cleaning her off. The runner was moving again, much more smoothly. Sabrina nodded.
"Take this,"
he said, pulling a fresh root from his vest pouch. After a few bites, taste exploded in her mouth. Tangy, sweet, effervescent. It was miraculous. Her stomach immediately settled. She thanked him while he stretched out on one of the benches across from her, his head resting on his arm.
"They drive a lot more gently with you in the back," she said. "That's 'cause they know I have to fix things. And now we're down one. Fools. Doubly fools that they don't realize it's 20 times cooler back here."
He smiled and winked at her.
"Not that I'm going to tell them."
Sabrina took satisfaction in the idea of the men roasting up front, the sun magnified upon them through the windscreen.
"Where are we going?"
she asked.
"Com camp. It's where the attacks are being coordinated. We've set up an antenna to aid in communications, because our teams plan on trying to knock out the ministry's communication system."
"The towers?"
"Yeah."
"Sprocket, do you think those towers might do something more than communications?"
Dr. Rindle has got everyone convinced that they are used to control people's minds. That is why everyone headed to the city to fight is wearing those T-Men helmets. But I'm not sure. I make things with my hands. The brain, I don't get."
She was quiet, thinking, calculating the effects of deactivating the towers. She remembered the woman she had seen wrestled off the prisoner transport, her face covered in gore, her humanity gone. Sprocket drew a palm screen from his pocket, the scenes illuminated on it lighting up his face. Sabrina recognized the noises and the voices immediately. The battle at the wall. The sound of projectile fire and plasma discharges popped and hissed from the speaker. Then they were cut short by an explosion, so powerful that the speaker rattled, the sound becoming more static than anything else. Rocks and rubble clacked against one another. Bran could be heard breathing heavily as he climbed up over the rubble. Then it stopped. Sprocket sighed and began tapping the screen, rearranging pixels, setting up repair algorithms.
"Bran's recorder video,"
Sabrina said as calmly as possible.
Yeah, he said, blowing air out between his lips. Nearly done, I think. Got slowed down because I lost the camera, but I had downloaded it. It's just as well. It was depressing carrying that thing around.
A hollow formed in her stomach, and she struggled to swallow. How long until you finish?
A couple hours. Still takes a long time.
Lindsey's efforts had failed. Sabrina had to tell him before he reached the end. But then what would she do? What if he turned on her, her last ally, and left her here in the desert? It was too much to risk. She would wait until they reached the camp, and if she could, somehow destroy the palm screen. She would make sure it met an accidental end. A bone-deep weariness settled over her. There was nothing she could do now. Maybe Sprocket would sleep. She settled back against the bench and decided to wait. He didn't doze off, but her own fatigue and the vibrations of the runner as it rolled steadily over the sand sea made her drowsy. When she woke, it felt like hours later, Sprocket had also fallen asleep. The runner's engine was whining steadily, the suspensor coils rocking with a regular rhythm. She called Sprocket's name softly, but he was unresponsive. She did not wait. She shifted across the floor as quietly as she could, trying not to disturb her chains. But just as she neared him, the runner slowed and came to a halt. The abrupt absence of noise and vibration woke him, and he sat up, blinking, the palm screen tucked just inside the pocket of his vest.
"Well, I guess we've arrived," he said.
Com Camp was nestled in a deep glen with steep cliffs of limestone on either side. Fig and pistachio trees grew in abundance, providing shade along a riverbed at the bottom of the valley, and cover for the antenna that had been erected along the spine of the ridges. A half a dozen more stolen runners, their rear beds packed with what appeared to be ministry cycles, sat parked under the trees. The tires were covered by blades of bloodgrass, their shoots green as spring sprouts, and their tips as dark as a knife pulled out of a murder victim. On either side of a stream bisecting the camp stood large tents. Under their canvas roofs were rows of empty cots covered in white sheets. Sprocket explained that they were infirmary tents.
"Hopefully we don't need them."
The command center was a room cordoned off by 3 parked runners and shaded by a roof of dried palm branches. The floor was trampled shrubs and grasses, and the space smelled of broken branches and crushed grass. Before discovering the hospital room in the caverns, Sabrina would have been surprised to find that the rebels had so much material. But now the projection table in the center of the command space, the communications equipment lined up alongside the runners, and multiple screens tracking the movements of soldiers did not faze her. Sprocket escorted her to the center. He had told her they wanted to interrogate her about security leading to and around the head ministry. Except for Dr. Rindle, she did not recognize many of the commanders around the table. She was relieved to see Grange in the corner, speaking with a woman in the same medical coveralls that Lindsey had worn. Something was different about Grange, and it took her a few moments to place it. Unlike the other men, he wore no weapon, not even a knife. Dr. Rindle looked up from the table, his eyes like some sort of violation on her body as they bounced behind his lenses.
"Good. You have brought our guest,"
he said with a nod to Sprocket. He pressed a key on the border of the table, and a dozen or so red dots imposed upon the screen disappeared and were replaced by blue ones. They were in places familiar to Sabrina, points at which there were security posts along the Bay Road leading from the city to the head ministry. The doctor asked for the number of officers stationed at each post. Sabrina stared at the map. It was rendered in minute detail, the white stone of the head ministry shining like a moon resting at the southern tip of the bay. She could make out the partly deconstructed buildings where she and Moshe were supposed to test out those new railguns and the new augmentation suit. She could still remember the laboratory number on its breast. 11.1.12-9. The road skirted the blue of the bay, past Joseph and Magdalene's, then fed into the tightly packed grid lines of Fortinbras. Dag's dream. She tried to ignore the wave of sadness and longing that filled her. Dr. Rindle's was no easy request. Give away the post's defenses and her colleagues could come to harm. Although she had never felt a great lasting affection from her fellow cadets or officers, she was aware of her oath to them, not to mention her feelings for Sean. She couldn't bear the thought of him coming to harm any more than she could stand the idea of Lindsey or Denalis being hurt. She decided to give them the truth, but no more information than anyone else could glean from driving the Bay Road. "These locations only have 2 or 3 officers in them," she said, indicating the posts at the end and beginning of the Bay Road, her chains jingling about her wrists as she pointed.
"How heavily armed are they?"
"Overestimate, and the rebels might attack with overwhelming force, killing Sean if he were stationed there for the day. Underestimate, and the rebels might expose themselves. Denalis, if he was there, could be killed." The other commanders were watching her skeptically. She was aware of Grange moving closer to the table. "I don't know. I'm only a cadet. I have yet to be posted there." Dr. Rindle believed her. He slid his fingers across the table, and the head ministry swung into view.
"The head ministry?"
he said. Sabrina shrugged her shoulders, more confident in the fiction that she knew nothing. "There are antique projectile guns on the turrets to either side of the gate. They do work. The blast doors are thick, but not always closed, depending on the time of day. Once inside, I don't know. There are gardens, fruit trees here," she said, pointing, hoping that the level of detail was enough to make them feel she was cooperating. Their representation already had the trees in place. Even Dag's Fallen Gods installation was marked, making her wonder if his energies would have been better used setting up defenses rather than eccentric artwork.
"Ideas are the most dangerous weapons," he had always said.
But now the ideas are coming knocking with guns. She had to give them something more. The wounds on her body were aching, her sense of vulnerability sharp. She swept her hands over the building. "Administrative offices are here. Council chamber here. Assembly hall here. I remember it from the tours." She stopped short of sharing Dag and Moshe's residences. She did not mention the laboratory where weapons and suit prototypes would be stored. She shared no more information than any child would know from a field trip to the ministry. Yet she still felt sick with a sense of betrayal.
"Anything else?"
one of the commanders asked her.
"She's clearly answered all she can,"
Grange said.
"Look at her. Sabrina, what did they do to you? Your head?"
"I fell in the back of the runner. My fault."
"Dr. Rindle, are you satisfied?"
"For now."
"Good. I'm taking her to the infirmary."
"That was not so bad,"
Sprocket said, leaning on a cabinet of medical supplies while the woman that Sabrina had seen earlier speaking with Grange cleaned her head with antiseptic. Her name was Helene, and the antiseptic she used was cooling. Grange was seated alongside Sabrina on an empty cot, shaking his head. He seemed to be having a conversation with himself.
"I've tried to talk them out of it, tried reasoning with them, but they don't listen."
Sabrina assumed he was speaking of the coming assault. "Why didn't you go with the others to the lake?" she asked.
"If I could not stop the killing, I felt compelled to help with the healing. I volunteered to organize the casualty tents," he said, waving his hand to include the tent and the others adjacent.
"Do you expect much wounded?" she asked, although she already knew the answer by the number of tents.
"I pray not. But if I am in charge, we'll take wounded from both sides."
"They'll say you've gone soft,"
Sprocket said, not looking up from his palm screen. He tapped a few more pixels into place.
"They already are."
Helene finished cleaning Sabrina's head and left the room, returning with a cup of tea for Sabrina. Parched as she was, Sabrina drank it quickly, even though it was difficult to maneuver the cup to her lips while still wearing manacles. A garbled noise erupted from the comm cube on Sprocket's belt. He put the palm screen away and put the cube to his ear. He listened carefully before speaking into it.
"This is Sparrow. Falcon, do you read?"
Grange stared at him intently. There was no answer from the cube.
"Who are you talking to?"
Sabrina asked, her words coming out slow and slurred.
"Denalis and Lindsey,"
he said, slipping the comm cube back to his belt and taking up the palm screen again.
"Looks like it was a false alarm, though."
He swept his fingertips across the illuminated face, his brow furrowed as he studied a new image.
"If they get Dagosta, and he's in danger, I'll go get them under the guise of having to go help with communications. Grange will come with me. He'll still have some sway over the men there. There are enough who don't want a slaughter, who just want freedom and justice.
Would those men stop Theopin if he wants to harm Dagosta? Sprocket shrugged.
Possibly.
Grange was quiet, his chin cupped in his hand as he stared straight into space. Where is Theopin? She asked.
Nobody knows,
Grange said, his eyes not moving. All four of them were quiet, the only sounds that of Sprocket tapping away at the palm screen and Helene picking up her supplies. One of the runners rumbled past the tent. Rickard was at the wheel, with Vards and Naelis and others clinging to the side with their helmets on and rifles strapped to their backs. Sabrina felt lightheaded and said so. Helene turned from where she was screwing the top onto the antiseptic bottle.
I put some herbs in your tea to help you rest. They are a natural sedative. You look as if you have not slept in days.
Sedative? No, she had to be awake to take the screen from Sprocket.
No, I don't want to,
she said, trying to sit up, but she was seized with dizziness. Grange caught her cup before she spilled it and eased down into her cot.
It's all right,
he said.
We'll look after you.
Chapter 29. Sprocket. Sabrina woke in the late afternoon. The tent was cool and quiet. She stepped outside, her head clearing slowly, her chains feeling heavier than before. 4 men were playing cards beneath a fig tree, empty plates resting amid the trampled blades of bloodgrass. One man stood upon seeing her. Unlike many of the soldiers Sabrina had encountered recently, he had a kind face, leading her to categorize him as one of Grange's. He offered her a canvas chair and followed up with a plate of bread, peas, and dates. She thanked him and ate ravenously. The camp was strangely quiet. Some of the runners had gone, and there were definitely fewer soldiers. Her intuition told her that the attacks had begun.
Where are Grange and Sprocket?
At the comm center, one of the men said as he leaned back against one of the remaining runners. Sabrina announced that she was going to the stream to wash her face, unsure if these men were her guards. The one who had given her the food smiled amicably, as if to say, by all means, then turned his attention back to his hand. The stream pooled deep and still around a languid bend near the tent. Sabrina splashed it on her face and hair, squeezing out her ponytail so that the water dripped pleasantly down her neck and shirt. She caught her trembling reflection on the surface, her head framed by a halo of sky, her pale skin appearing blue. The necklace that Lindsey had made for her swung forward, the little heads dripping as if they were weeping, their tears dimpling the surface of the stream with chains of rings. The topmost leaves of the trees stirred in a breeze that was a whisper from the sky, swelling the valley with blithe susurrations. Lulled by the sounds of the leaves, the hum of insects, the swirl of the stream, she was filled with an unexplainable sense of wholeness. She found herself able to forget the ongoing battle, the unanswered questions, the impending consequences. For a fleeting moment, she could believe that all was in place with the world. She tried to remember the last time she had felt so. Her mind landed on one of the evenings she watched the enormity of color spreading from one end of the sky to the other as the sun set over the sea. Lindsey had sat beside her on the roof of her parents' house, the two of them silent, too taken with the tableau before them to be disturbed by the scrapes and bumps they had from climbing the drain spout, or the way the roof tiles burned the undersides of their thighs. Sprocket's face appeared next to her reflection in the stream.
Grange needs us at the comm center, he said.
She got up, holding her wrists high to keep from tripping on her chains. Sprocket moved ahead of her, grass swishing against his trousers. He motioned to a runner on the opposite side of the tent.
We need to be quick. Jump in.
Sabrina stepped up into the cab. Sprocket fastened the chains to a strut of the frame. He explained it was just for show, so that Dr. Rindle did not think he was showering her with too much favoritism. He climbed into the driver's side and started the engine. The runner moved through the camp slowly, weeds and shrubs brushing up against its underside, branches of the trees snapping on its windscreen. Sabrina was silent, trying to hold on to the tranquility she had grasped beside the stream. Sprocket said nothing, but the muscles of his jaws were working the blade of bloodgrass in his mouth furiously. After they passed a few gangs of men holding their weapons, she felt the spell fading and spoke up.
How are things with the attack? Chaotic, but they must have expected it,
he said with a flash of disgust on his face. He offered nothing else. She wondered if there was something else bothering him. As they neared the parked runners that formed the comm center, Sprocket sped up, rolling past, then swinging the vehicle onto a road that led out of the camp. The runner bumped and shook over divots in the road while he increased their speed.
Sprocket, what's going on?
Sabrina was bounced up off the seat and tried to steady herself against the frame of the vehicle.
Just shut up.
His palm screen was in his right breast pocket, shoved halfway down, the flap stuffed beneath it. She took a deep breath, leaned back in her seat, and stared straight ahead as they climbed a pass out of the valley.
So you know,
she said.
How could you?
He said, not looking at her.
I can't explain.
I'll say.
Does Grange know?
I didn't tell him. He's gone soft. Wouldn't have the spine to do what needs to be done.
She knew what that was. The chains were still cold from the water of the stream. They jingled as they rumbled over another rough patch. She stared out the window and waited, watching each tree pass by, noting blossoms, branches, swallows perched in them, the colors and textures coming to her in exquisite detail. Even the smells around her, the cotton of her shirt, the metal of the chains, the plastic of the seat, struck her with an unfamiliar potency. Yet none of it was satisfying, because she would die so far from her friend.
Tell Lindsey I'm sorry.
Did she know?
No, she lied. He yanked a comm cube from its sleeve on his belt, tossed it to the seat beside him, and jammed it with his thumb. A recorded conversation emerged from its tiny speaker, the voices small but familiar.
Falcon, this is Sparrow, do you read?
Sprocket's recorded voice called out.
Sparrow, it's chaos. They blew the towers. People went mad. It's the rage. Mothers are killing their own children. People are fleeing the city. We're pinned down at the head ministry.
There was an explosion, a confusion of voices, the sound of something rubbing against the comm-cube's microphone. Running feet. Screams.
Falcon! Falcon!
Sprocket!
Lindsey's voice returned, doing away with call names.
Sprocket, get out! Just run! It's the faces! They're death!
You're not making sense.
Tell Sabrina to run. Just run. I'm sorry I broke my promise. Tell her I'm sorry. I love her.
The recording stopped. Sabrina's body felt rigid and cold, yet sweat beaded on her forehead. Her hands shook within her bindings.
Have you heard anything else?
She asked, struggling to control the tremor in her voice.
No. Everything's gone dead.
The runners stopped. They had crossed the ridge and out of the valley, the landscape transforming from alpine forest to sand flats. Wind whipped at the vehicle with ribbons of dust. Sprocket drew a blaster and pointed it at Sabrina, while he released her chains from the lock on the floor.
Get out.
She obeyed, her eyes on the southern horizon, looking in the direction of Fortinbras and the head ministry. As Sprocket rounded the corner of the runner, he motioned for her to drop to her knees.
Sprocket, please let me go. Please let me try to save her. At least let me die trying.
Like Brand died trying to save you? Get down.
Please, it was an accident. I don't want to die like this.
The details of the weapon that would end her life seared themselves into her mind. The scratched muzzle, the dirt deeply embedded in its hand grips. The blast plate cracked at the corner. She had helped Sprocket rehabilitate this very weapon, she realized with poignant irony. She turned her eyes away and stared at the ground. The chains pulled between her knees made neat curlicues in the dust with their links. It reminded her of that day so long ago that she came upon Lindsey, bringing the dirt alive with her drawings. It felt as if something inside her was about to break.
Fine,
she said in a small voice.
Just get it over with.
But Sprocket did nothing. When she had been staring at the ground for nearly a minute, she looked up to see him with his head cocked to the side, his eyes darting back and forth from her to the sky. He backed away, his finger to his lips. Then she heard the noise. A high-pitched scream. A child's voice or a hawk's cry, stretched out over an impossible length, the frequency rising with the approach. It was over them immediately, a flash of green laser light dancing across them as the Elved changed course and circled. After one orbit it swooped downward, fantails of sand rising behind it as it hovered in the air, one arm trained on Sprocket. The turbines cut as it set down, one talon followed by the other. Its hydraulics hissed as it rose to its full height. The morning sun glinted on its polished metal carapace. Air fans were still roaring behind it to cool its thrusters, the noise bringing to mind the growl of an animal. Its tail unfurled behind it, a counterbalance to its head as it stalked up alongside the runner. The contrast between the two machines was like an eagle and a toad. Number 9, its breastplate read. Miniature ghosts of dust danced around its feet, set into motion by its fans. Sabrina did not recall seeing this number before. She wondered if it had been called in from the wall to thwart the attackers. It was similar to the others, although it was taller, the lights and intake vents lining its breastplates more numerous and more streamlined than those of other Elveds. One difference stood out as well. 2 large rockets, half the Elved's length, rode on its back beneath its retracted wings.
Amazing,
Sprocket said in a breathless sigh, his weapon now turned on the Elved.
Amazing.
The machine slowly circled, its left limb transforming in a blur of motion. Plates, springs, rods spun, shifted, and folded until they came together in the shape of a human hand. A thumb and 3 fingers pointed downward, a single forefinger extended. Sprocket was breathing as if he had just run a sprint. Sweat flattened his hair against his forehead. His arm with the blaster hung limply at his side. He raised his free hand, creeping forward, his boots scuffing in the sand as he reached to meet the touch of the machine. A tentative smile was forming on his face, his eyes darting between Sabrina and the Elved.
You see? It knows me.
A star of light appeared between him and the extended finger, crackling in the air. Sabrina screamed and shielded her eyes as the ribbon of plasma quivered, connecting the machine and Sprocket. He dropped to the ground. A green flare persisted in her vision, but out of the corner of her eye she could see him convulsing, smoke rising from his clothes, especially the pockets and belt where all of his electronic devices had shorted and melted. He was still shaking, his legs kicking out, his arms jerking, when the machine turned on her. She scrambled away, but the reach of the mechanized limbs closed the distance immediately. One arm shot down it between her legs. She screamed again but felt nothing strike her body. Instead, the chains were taut, and a clamp on the end of the Elved's arm cut through them. The loose ends dropped to the ground, followed by more rapid shifting of plates and pieces on the Elved. The hand returned. With 4 smaller, shorter blasts of plasma, the manacles dropped off Sabrina's wrists and ankles. The Elved moved even closer. The smell of oil in its joints, of titanium carbide warming in the sun, filled her nose. Servos spun. Pumps hissed. She jumped as something touched her from behind. She had backed up into the runner. She could see her own terrified expression in the impervious convex face of the Elved. A scared, soft, fleshy life form cowering in front of a metal beast. Green lettering flashed on the face. It took her some time before she realized she was meant to read it. Cadet Sabrina Sabria. She nodded and stuttered. That's me. Deliver us. Sweat was trickling into her eyes. Her body was shaking as she stared at the words. For a moment she refocused, saw her own confused expression, then looked again at the words. They were unchanged. Deliver us. She shook her head, but if the Elved had time to notice, it made no reply. Instead, it stood up, the tail flowing into the air behind as the thrusters erupted beneath spreading wings. With a burst of heat, it ascended into the sky on twin streams of smokeless blue flames. Sabrina rushed to Sprocket, the methylene exhaust stinging her eyes and nose. His shirt was singed, and his flesh blackened on his shoulder where the bolt had struck him. His body was warm, hot in some places, his skin red and beginning to erupt in blisters. She knew the voltage had stopped his heart, and she was pressing on his chest, ready to begin compressions, when a change in the pitch of the Elved's engines caused her to look up. It was circling back over the hills they had left, riding down on a shallow angle. Gunfire popped from the valley. A few red flares of plasma shot by the Elved. Its body was extended to its full flight length now, tipping on its wing to follow the curve of the glen. Sabrina watched in silent horror as one rocket, then the other, fell free of the black machine and went screaming below the ridge. She grabbed Sprocket under the arm and dragged him over the ground to the leeward side of the runner, just as the flash from the explosions cast their shadows across the hardpan. The first shockwave blew the glass out of the cab and hit her chest like a fist. The second lifted the runner onto two wheels. Sabrina waited helplessly as the vehicle teetered on the verge of rolling onto them. It was poised right over their heads, and she realized that she would not have enough time to drag Sprocket to safety if it fell. She kicked the side, hoping the added force would be just enough. Luck was with them. The runner teetered, then crashed back down on its tires and remained upright. She breathed again. She turned Sprocket on his back and began compressing his chest, leaning over to put her ear to his mouth. He made gasping noises as the air rushed in and out of his lungs, but when she stopped, he was listless. She punched his chest, then checked his pulse. Nothing. Her arms and shoulders were tiring. By her count, it had been over 3 minutes. Too long. She ran to the driver's side door of the cab and yanked the release for the battery cover. A latch popped to the front of the cab and banged against the frame. She returned to Sprocket and made a few more compressions before pulling him flush against the runner. 5 more compressions. The cables from the battery ran behind the turbine well. She ripped them free and tore at the insulation with her teeth until the wiring was exposed. She found a knife in Sprocket's pocket and sliced open his shirt and vest. She stuffed the ends of the wires into his armpits and pressed his arms against his sides. Clear of his body, she slammed her palm down on the battery test switch. Voltage stiffened Sprocket's body, then he went still. She put her ear to his mouth, her hand on his chest. Nothing. She hit the testing switch again. Sprocket shook, but his heart was as still as before. She scrambled for his vest, digging through the pockets, tossing the contents aside, burning her fingers on the ruined palm screen until she found a roll of tape. She took the cable ends from his armpits and slapped them down on either side of his heart with tape. She hit the switch again. Sprocket gasped. "Sprocket!" She jumped to his side, tearing the cables away from his chest. He tried to speak, but his eyes were still fluttering. She held his face in her hands and kept calling his name. Screaming and breathless, her voice caught, and she had to turn her head to cough and clear her throat. That was when she saw the smoke billowing out from behind the ridge, a black wall like the front of a thunderstorm. "Sabrina." He was grabbing her hand. She squeezed it, then released him, remembering his burns. His eyes had refocused, but he was in too much pain to say anything more. Sabrina grabbed a medkit from the cab and sat him up against the runner, out of the sun. "I guess you'll have to wait to kill me," she said, spreading ointment on his seared flesh. He nodded feebly. He didn't talk, making her afraid she was losing him again. Then he pulled her close to him by her shirt. "What happened?" "Elved came, hit you with a bolt, stopped your heart. You were dead." He clenched his eyes as if remembering the pain. She paused in her spreading of ointment. "Sprocket, did you see anything? On the other side?" He shook his head no. "What do you think that means?" "I guess it means that I am your afterlife." "Then I'm in trouble." She took another look at the rising wall of smoke. The highest reaches were being flattened by winds. "Where is my patrol suit?" "In the runner by the infirmary tent." Sabrina leaned back into the turbine well and, using his tape, reattached the cables she had ripped out. From the cab, she tested the engine. When the turbine started turning and the engine hummed steadily, she crouched down next to him again. "You need to get in this thing and drive north. The whole world is falling apart. Go to the wall, surrender.
Stay as far from the cities as you can. You got it?
What about you?
She was already pulling one of the cycles from the rear bay of the runner.
I'm going to get Lindsey.
Chapter 30. Sea of Blades. Sabrina tore away the bottom of her shirt, dipped it into the stream, and wrapped it around her mouth and nose. The scent of sweaty cotton and stream water filled her nostrils. The valley had been transformed into a nightmare of twisted metal and charred trees. Curled human forms lay with tongues of flames flickering about them, their skin charred black, their clothes drifting away in ashes. All recognizable landmarks had been erased. Tents had been ripped away, runners tipped, trees uprooted. Sabrina rode the cycle close to the river, rolling over withered grass and smoldering debris. She did her best to estimate where the hospital tent had stood, and more importantly, where the runner containing her suit had been parked. There were survivors, although no one was uninjured. Their hair and clothes were seared away, and their faces lacerated, their wounds terrible and bloody, their skin blistered. Deeper into the camp, believers who had been spared death were helping each other. One man missing an arm carried a man missing a leg from the knee down. A woman in bloody hospital garb leaned against a tree, her face ghostly white and eerily blank, as she pulled her severed leg alongside her and set it beside her bloody stump. Her eyes followed the passing soldiers, as if expecting one to stop. Sabrina could not turn away from her gaze. She idled the cycle and knelt down. The woman's lips were moving, and she had to lean in close to hear her voice. "Water." Sabrina took a canteen from the cycle and filled it from the stream, though the water was fouled with ash and oil. The woman moved a trembling hand off her lifeless leg and took the canteen. With the other hand, she tried to grab Sabrina, but Sabrina wrenched herself away. "I'm sorry. I have to go." Sabrina stopped beside the inferno that had been the hospital tent, the metal frames of the cots warping in the heat, and the plastic cabinets of supplies collapsing in molten puddles. The runner she was looking for had fallen halfway into the river, its cab partly submerged, the water as high as the steering wheel and the instrumentation panels. She waded in to reach the storage lockers at the side. In the chaos of the bombed camp, it had been easy to find an abandoned blaster lying on the ground, and she used one to blow open the locks, one after the other. She threw clothes, shoes, and blankets over her shoulder and into the water. When the heat from the encroaching flames grew unbearable, she wrapped a sodden blanket across her back and continued to rummage through the supplies. Wherever her bare skin was exposed, the heat stung, but she kept searching, splashing water on herself as her desperation grew. Her suit wasn't in the first two lockers. When her suit wasn't in the lockers on the other side of the runner, she began to panic, striking the fender with her fist. One storage case had fallen free of the runner and was stuck deep into the ground just above her, the impact snapping the lock. She scrambled up the slope of the bank, the wet blanket sloughing on her as she tossed the case upside down. The smooth black mesh of her patrol suit tumbled out, and she snatched it up, holding it close to her face before stripping down, slipping it on, and slapping the power cell into her belt. She picked up another abandoned blaster and holstered it, strapping the first to her ankle.
"Sabrina."
It was Grange's voice, but she barely recognized the figure who had spoken the words. He lay sprawled against a rock, one of the fallen fig trees crushed against his chest, his eyes watering, and his lips and face blistered. The tree had absorbed most of the heat of the blast, but its smoldering trunk was burning him. Sabrina raced over, lifted the tree, and threw it into the river, where its curled leaves trembled in clouds of hissing steam. His beard was burned to the skin of his face. His clothes were gray with ash. The tree off him, he managed to stand, leaning heavily on Sabrina. The skin of his hands was by turns red, yellow, and black. She tried to help him to the bank of the stream where the surrounding flames and smoke were thinner. The cracking of projectile rifles erupted on the ridge. The turbines of an Elved screamed closer.
"Grange," she said. "It's coming back. Come on, get into the river."
He resisted her, pulling his arm free.
"No, I'm not fighting." "I'm not asking you to fight, just to hide," she yelled as the roar of the turbines grew. Grange shook his head, brushing the debris from his hair. "My faith is my sword and my shield,"
he said, kneeling down and gingerly placing his burnt hands together.
Don't be a fool, Grange! She screamed over the gunfire. I will pick you up and carry you if I have to. Don't you dare. He spared me once already, and he will again. Our master is one of love and faith. Grange, make your choice, Sabrina. When she raised the blaster and depressed the setting to stun, she saw Bran staring back at her. The roar crescendoed overhead, joined by the second sound of a rocket engine igniting and ripping into the air. The gunfire ceased as rebels ran for cover. She darted for the river, her feet tripping on hot, crackling debris. Her ears were filled with the boom of detonation and a noise like a flag snapping in the breeze as a wall of flames surged through the remaining trees, strangling trunks and branches, sucking the oxygen from the air in a backdraft that sent ashes and dust into her face in a hot wind. She hit the water and dove beneath the surface, the hiss of fire on the surface reaching her on the bottom. Smooth pebbles tumbled under her hands as she tried to find a hold, finally settling upon some exposed tree roots. Currents as hot as bath water passed over her. She pressed herself into the bed of the stream, holding her breath until she thought her lungs would burst and she would pass out. As she waited for the flames to dissipate, she felt another blast. The surface of the water roiled with bubbles and steam, and waves slapped the banks. Finally, she either had to rise for air or drown. She surfaced into an inferno, the water steaming. A wall of flames towered before her, crowned with impenetrable black smoke. The heat radiated through any part of her suit that was not submerged. Updrafts of hot air gusted wildly, sending up vortexes of charred tent fabric, smoking twigs and ash. She saw no sign of Grange, and heard no cries. Where he had knelt was nothing but roaring flames. The tree she had thrown had been reduced to half its original size, a withered husk leaning against the twisted wreckage of the runner, its metal marbled black and gray from the heat. A blast shook her and sent ripples through the water as another rocket exploded farther down the valley. She pulled her visor over her eyes, kept her shirt over her mouth, and waded upstream, straining to look past the bodies and the body parts floating around her. At the head of the camp, where the flames tapered off, she got lucky. She found a cycle that was still intact. She charged the engine and started for Fortinbras. She entered the city on Miller Road, which took her through the blocks. CRPs full of frightened people sped past. A few tried pulling her over, recognizing her as a member of the security ministry, but she waved them away. Some CRPs she passed were ominously empty, pulled to the side of the road, the doors left open, the occupants nowhere to be found. Diagoras Avenue, the main thoroughfare through the blocks, was impassable, a barricade of stacked furniture and scrap metal rising from the street as high as second-story windows. A half-dozen figures tracked her from the other side, peering through gaps between kitchen chairs and reclamation bins. She could not be certain what alliances and sides might have sprung up during the attacks. After all, she was just blocks away from the same alleyway where she had seen the words, "Theopin will set us free," scrawled onto a wall. To avoid confrontation, she turned down an alleyway to seek a detour, the cycle turbines roaring off the close walls, the wheel bouncing through the drainage gutter. She emerged with a clothesline across the windscreen. As she tugged it free, people ran past, making for the few houses with open front doors and windows dark with furniture and boards thrown across them. A man carrying a young child and towing an older one behind hurried past. An old woman pounded on a door for someone to let her inside. A teenage boy ran into the street carrying a young boy, his face gone snow white, his neck a bloody, gaping wound. A window shutter opened and closed as she passed. Infrared showed that people were clustered inside the homes in tight knots on the upper floors. She clicked back to the visible spectrum just as a woman with a bloodied face leapt in front of her cycle. She could not stop in time and rolled over the woman, the tires thumping against her chest cavity, compressing the air out of her lungs so that she coughed and gagged. Sabrina wrenched the steering column and slammed on the brake, the injury in her right leg causing her to cry out. The woman was dressed in formal slacks with a sharp crease in them. Her white blouse shimmered, but was spattered with blood that also darkened the ends of her graying hair. Her face was invisible, her chin down on her chest, but she had already sat up, surprising Sabrina. Are you all right? Get away from her!
A voice cried out from one of the windows. The woman snapped her head in Sabrina's direction. Her eyes were wide, white balls in her sockets, her mouth a gaping hole of gore. Her tongue flicked back and forth across teeth matted with what looked like flesh. She leapt up quickly with the recovery of an elite pitchball player.
Run!
Another voice called out from the windows. The woman was already charging Sabrina, a feral screech rending the air. Sabrina could not ditch her cycle, nor turn it around in time. She drew her blaster and fired 3 stuns into the woman to no effect. With the woman nearly an arm's reach away, she flicked the setting to lethal and fired a bolt of rose-colored plasma into the woman's leg. A cloud of red vapor sprayed out onto the cobblestones along with a hiss not unlike that of flesh over flame. When she breathed in, the air smelled of cooked meat. The woman's face slapped against the street while she gnashed at the cobblestones with her teeth, her fingers digging between them to pull her forward, her good leg flailing like some hideous tail, pushing her towards Sabrina, the slacks on the injured leg smoldering. Sabrina turned the cycle and charged the throttle to full, speeding down the narrow street to put as much distance between herself and the thing as possible. Her hand was shaking as she adjusted the rearview mirror to reassure herself that the woman had not recovered and followed her. With her eyes on the mirror, she never saw the cable across the road until its braided metal was in her face. The windscreen snapped with a loud pop. The impact was like being struck with a club. The cycle skidded away, scraping to a stop on its side. She found herself flung backwards onto the street. Dazed, she could barely move. She was marginally aware of the 2 teenage boys who emerged from an adjacent alleyway. Too weakened to look up, she listened as they righted the cycle, climbed on, charged its engine, and fled down the street, disappearing around a corner. It was quiet, the way a city street could be quiet, while more distant sounds floated overhead. Sirens, the hiss and crackle of plasma rifles, staccato shouts barked out, but no footsteps. No bloody-faced ferals like that woman. Sabrina crawled to a sidewalk where she caught her breath. When she stood up, her right leg and left foot protested. Her neck hurt to move as well from being hung up on the cable. She fired a shot at the place where it was anchored to the wall, only to miss, the brickwork splintering apart with each misfire. It took 3 more shots before one of her attempts struck true, and the cable dropped to the ground. Not good. She checked the power cell of the blaster. It was full. What she did not have in accuracy, she would be able to make up for in quantity of shots. She took stock of her assets. The cycle was gone, but she had an extra blaster and a charged top-of-the-line patrol suit. She was just 10 blocks from the station, where she could retrieve more weapons and different transportation. She checked the communicator on her visor. Dead. All communications had been wiped out. The most immediate threat, the ferals, those citizens rendered mad by the destruction of the comm towers, were at least easily recognizable. They were fast, strong, inhumanly so, but they were also dumb. It was not a cunning rage, but simple, atavistic. Given enough lead time, she could deal with that. Other threats, rebels, had moved on to different areas, perhaps to engage security forces. She wondered if other officers would see her as friend or foe. To that point, would rebels? She sighed. She was likely the only one in this fight without an ally. It was time to move, and she forced her legs to stand. Pain doubled her over, her rib now adding to the aggravation in her legs. After straightening a second time, she limped down the street, stopping often to lean against the wall, her blaster lifted to her eye level, every corner, window, and door studied through the crosshairs of her weapon. The suit knew she was injured. The visor readout indicated that treatment was underway. She felt cool pressure on her most severe injuries as the suit emitted an analgesic, the compound causing more pain on the seared flesh of her right foot before it began to feel better. After a while, she could manage a brisk walk, just short of a jog. The pain from her rib, which she was sure was fractured, lessened. Now the screams and shouts she had heard earlier were closer, as a new wave of fleeing citizens stampeded past. Off her bike, she could not ignore them, although she did her best to shrug off their pleading hands and faces. Wide-eyed people told of their relatives going into rages, killing their own children. They did not understand what was happening. Where was the security ministry? Could she help? Could she explain?
I could. But would they believe me? Or doubt, like I did?
They spoke in a rush of panicked words, talking of smoke rising from the south, comm towers toppling down, armed men running through the streets, firing at officers. Sabrina told them which streets she had traveled, so they knew which routes were safe. When it was clear she was headed in the opposite direction, they left her alone, staring bewilderedly at her as they paced down the street to safety, and she toward danger. The ferals were easy to distinguish, wandering blood-soaked through the streets, their backs hunched, their heads down, like coiled snakes ready to strike. She fired on them, torn between the knowledge she was removing a threat and the truth that she was simply killing an innocent victim of a more widespread violation. Weinlard Street was a massacre. Bodies were strewn about, great pools of blood congealed among cobblestones. It was difficult to tell the ferals from their victims, but as she neared the bodies, she could see at least 3 ferals were dead, their heads swollen from blows, their necks twisted around. The residents had been able to put up some defense, although at the cost of at least 6 of their own lives. At Resnick Street, a feral stood up from over a boy's body where it had been feeding and charged her. The feral had once been a slender man with bright blue eyes and short-cropped hair. Now those eyes were bulging, the hair stained red with blood. Long legs and arms gave it speed and a dangerous reach. She fired 2 shots, each going wide. The third struck it in the chest. It scampered around a corner into an alleyway. She followed, fired again, hitting its leg. It dropped to the ground. She closed in to kill it, but even as she looked up from its dead body, she knew she was losing precious time.
I don't have time to be an exterminator.
She moved down the street at a faster pace. Around the next corner, a barricade of crates and furniture stood in her way. This one was abandoned. Worse, it had been breached. A gap where a kitchen table had been shoved aside by a feral, leaving bloody handprints, was a silent testament to the defenders' defeat. A dead man lay on the other side, his killer having left a trail of bloody footprints into the adjacent alleyway. She covered 4 more blocks. Houses were empty, infrared showing her nothing but cold rooms. She had just 5 more blocks to go to reach the station, but after 3 she found activity in a house on the corner. She switched to the visible spectrum. Bodies of a mother and child lay strewn across the curb farther down the road. The building in front of her was an apartment complex, but no door faced her. 2 lone figures wandered the floors. Even on infrared, she could recognize them as ferals. She was prepared to leave both to their rampaging, but one on the 3rd floor was swinging a limb at a thin red line that the visor detected as a wall or door. In the next room, she could make out a closet with 3 small blobs bunched together.
Children.
She raced down the alleyway, leaping over 3 bodies. As she searched for the entrance, the pounding of the feral in the apartment above stopped. A switch to infrared showed that the bedroom door had given way, and the feral was racing across the room. It stopped short of the children. The pounding resumed, this time on an even thinner closet door. A stairwell entrance was on her left. She raced up, ignoring the protests of her leg and foot. The hallway on the 3rd floor was bare and abandoned. She kicked in the first door and entered the apartment, only to realize she was in the wrong one. The pounding was coming from the next room over. A wall stood between her and the children. A family portrait fell from it as the feral continued its attack on the other side. She retraced her steps, crashing through the bedroom, living room, and hallway again, finding the next apartment door was already open, bloody handprints across it. She entered, blaster raised. First the hallway. Next was the living room, where she noted scattered toys. She entered the kitchen, calling out and trying to attract the feral's attention. The kitchen table was cluttered with glossy magazines. Children's drawings hung on the walls. A pot was melting on the stove, filling the air with an acrid smell. She kicked over a child's high chair, but the noise was drowned out by a sound like a tree branch cracking, followed by the screams of terrified children. She abandoned caution and bolted through the doorway, rounding a corner into the bedroom. The closet door had given way, but the oldest child, a lithe blonde girl of no more than 10, was holding it in place, frustrating the reach of the feral, a rotund woman in a nightshirt, her brown hair a tangled mess stuck together with gore. Sabrina did not have a clear shot without endangering the children, so she ran across the room, jumping on the bed, and cried out, "Hey!" The woman turned, wide-eyed, snarling. Sabrina fired 2 shots at her head, 2 at her chest. She fell, still twisting for the closet door, her jaws working like a fish struggling for air. Sabrina fired 2 more shots into the back of her skull. She held the blaster away as she stepped through the red mist hanging in the air and pulled the door back. The blonde girl had her arms around a younger child with dark hair of about 6, and an even younger boy about 3.
"It's all right now. I'm here to help."
The girl surprised Sabrina by helping the other 2 children out of the wreckage of the closet, handing over the boy who immediately wrapped his arms around Sabrina's neck. Then the oldest led the younger girl out by the hand and said to her,
"Don't look, Nani,"
as they passed the dead feral. Once they were away from the body, Sabrina bent down and said,
"You did really good. What's your name?"
Amat. That is my brother Drim, and this is Nani. She's our neighbor.
"You know where your parents are?"
Amat shook her head. Sabrina told her it was all right, and that she would take them someplace safe. They followed her down the hallway, their feet a comforting patter behind her. She was trying to find a way to position her blaster while holding on to Drim when she turned the corner and saw the man standing in the kitchen. His shirt was unbuttoned, his tails hanging over his undershorts, which squeezed tight against his fat, hairy legs. His beard was tinged with red particles, and his nostrils flared repeatedly as he took in the smell of the melting pot on the stove.
2,
she cursed herself. There had been 2 ferals, she remembered now. She threw Drim to his sister. He began screeching. The man lunged. Sabrina raised her blaster only to have the shot go wide as Drim jumped back on her. She stumbled backwards, tossing the boy again and screaming at Amat to hold him. She knew the feral was right behind her, and she threw out a back kick with her left foot, her burns exploding in pain as she struck the man in his sternum. He was too big to stop, and he fell forward on top of her. Her blaster clattered to the floor out of reach. They traded blows, her arms quickly reaching the limits of their endurance. The feral was most interested in the children. After striking home with 2 punches to Sabrina's face, he extricated himself to pursue smaller quarry. Amat had raced away with Drim in her arms, but Nani had frozen in the middle of the hall, a puddle forming at her feet. Sabrina grabbed the man's foot, anger providing her more speed than the suit could have ever produced. She wrenched his foot and dragged him, flopping and screaming, back into the kitchen. A block of knives on the counter caught her attention, and she reached for it, but he kicked free of her, standing between her and the blaster. His nostrils hissed, and his teeth ground together. Her face only reached the level of his shoulders, and he reared to an even greater height. Sabrina grabbed the melting pot from the stove and threw it into his face. He roared, but still came across the room towards her, the floor shaking under his weight. She dove for the knives, but he caught her midway and threw her. The kitchen table collapsed beneath her as she landed. Magazines made a fluttering noise as they tumbled from the table to the floor. The children's drawings ripped away from the walls and fell across her prone body. He was immediately on top of her, one eye clouded and burnt with debris from the melted pot, his teeth making a clacking noise as he bit at her face. She tried kicking with her left leg, but it was still too painful. She raised her right, planting her foot in his chest, but his weight was enormous. Her knee was soon in her face as he pressed even closer, the tips of his fingers scraping at her eyes. She gave a renewed push to buy herself a gulp of air, but he was quickly pressing back, twisting her head as he pulled her hair. She raised the other leg, but it caused her to slide down the table. He started striking at her head. She kicked wildly, her ankle passing through her field of vision. Her ankle where she had strapped the spare blaster. He bore down on her, breaking past her defenses, the hair of his face, the sweat from his pores, his mouth open with its gnashing teeth so close. She could smell his body's stink, his fetid breath. Lights in her eyes as he struck her head. She felt for her blaster, her awareness coming apart, split to pieces under each blow. Her thumb on the safety as he fell against her, turning her wrist against the weight of his body to aim. A man of similar size, his shoulders great mounds under a checkered shirt, his chest a wall of musculature that had so many times served her as a pillow. Her father. His back was to her as he fought with her mother, who was screaming, beating him in hysterics. Her swinging arms knocked over appliances and spilled jars of rice and spices, soapy water from the sink. She was uncontrollable. Feral. Her father's eye was swelling and bruised, his forehead and cheeks bleeding from her nails raking his face. A button of his shirt had popped off and fallen to the kitchen floor. Sabrina bent to pick it up from the scattered coffee beans and rice grains, and then another button as it fell, when her father cried out.
"Stay back, Annalise!"
He said it over his shoulder, then it was her mother's face that was there, the skin on her chin wrinkling as she pressed against him, hissing between her teeth.
"I'll kill her!"
Her father pleaded. He called for help. He had pinned his wife between the counter and the sink, holding her back. Sabrina hated every moment of it. She did not understand. She cried for them to stop, but then her mother lunged for her. Her dress ripped as he held her back, legs kicking into the air, her arms stretching out for Sabrina with curled fingers.
"Lies! Liar! All lies! You! I hate you! Hate all of you! You're not even my husband! What have they done? All of you who hate tricked us!"
Her father's brow furrowed, pleading.
"Miriam, please, she's your daughter. It's me, Peter. Oh, please."
His arms so powerful, Sabrina trusted him to hold her and twirl her high above his head. Never once did she ever fear falling. She could never imagine pain or hurt from those arms. But just as Peter could never harm Sabrina, he could not harm his wife. As Miriam relaxed for a moment, causing him to relent, she took advantage of his lapse and spun away, diving across the room, again for Sabrina. In that moment, Sabrina knew her mother would kill her. And it was her mother, so she could not resist. She knew she must deserve to die. Her father screamed, a sound deep from that drum of a chest, so loud that Sabrina thought it actually caused the front door to explode. There were men running into the house. One tossed aside a chair and raised a gun as he came to the middle of the room. Her father yelled, his face bloody. His wife in a torn dress ran from him. Of course, he looked the aggressor. For a moment, he looked to be the feral. The man in the center of the room fired 2 shots into that chest. That wall that Sabrina had thought could never break, broke in 2 bloody pops. Her father fell against the counter, his eyes wide, his cheeks puffed with escaping breath, the cabinet splashed with red, his feet sliding on beans, his gaze on his daughter as she still clutched his shirt button. Her mother was bearing down in her direction, her hair a dark halo about her, the whites of her eyes so wide. A 3rd shot threw her mother against the wall. She crumpled, lying on the floor as if overtaken by sleep, her hair now matted and wet. More men swept into the room, bending over the invisible form of her father behind the counter. Sabrina found herself staring at a splash of red on the wall that was her mother, and was not her mother. This was so much worse than when she had colored on the wall with her crayons, or when she had spilled her juice on the couch. This redness was a stain no amount of paint would cover. Sabrina's eyes slid to a place on the wall that was undisturbed, where a painting of a sailboat, its sail a chip of white on a rocky silvery sea, a sea of blades, hung. Why was she so worried, she thought, when she could send that little girl, Annalise, who caused all of this, whose own mother hated her so, whose own mother wanted her to die, to that little boat? She could even see her, a small speck of black, small and so insignificant that only Sabrina knew she was there on that sea beneath that sail. Forgotten. Exiled where she deserved to be. In her place was a girl who was invulnerable and strong, like the man who had stopped her parents from fighting, who had brought order, who lifted her up in his arms in that very moment to hold her, his voice booming and commanding to the men around him, yet his face wet with tears. She would be strong and bring order like him. He said his name was Dag.